The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I am Kristen Delkamp from ICF, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today's training is part of our racial equity series and is entitled Internal Racism. It is my privilege now to introduce today's first presenter, Donald Whitehead from Racial Equity Partners. Donald, take it away.
Thank you, Kristen, and good morning, afternoon, everybody. We're probably in different parts of the country, so it's actually afternoon here as well. But thank you all for joining us today. I am Donald Whitehead. I am one of the co-founders of Racial Equity Partners. And if you've been with us for the last few weeks, we've explored various topics that started with a history of racism and brought us to this point where we're talking about different aspects of racism. We normally talk about the three different levels of racism, but we'll introduce you to one more level that we haven't explored. Just a little bit about my history and my work. I have been working on homelessness issues for the better part of 30 years at this point, homelessness and poverty. I started out with poverty, have worked at every level of homeless service delivery, from outreach through case management, through program management, have been executive director on a couple of occasions. I also serve, in addition to my work with REP, as the executive director of the National Coalition for the Homeless. Have been working on racial equity since as long as I've been working on homelessness, and joined with Jeff Olivet, who's now the director of the Interagency Council on Homelessness. We formed Racial Equity with a couple of other partners. And prior to some of the inflection points that happened, the deaths of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, we were doing this work before then, but obviously people really got interested in the work since then. We have tried to connect homelessness and structural racism in ways that haven't been examined before. So we thank you for being here. That's a long introduction. I'm going to pass it to Rashima Melson.
Thank you, Donald. Welcome, everyone. My name is Rashima Melson. My pronouns are she, her, and I identify as Black. I also work alongside with Donald as a rep associate and also CEO of Pain into Purpose. And we're so excited to be here with you today to talk about internalized racism. Before we move on, I want to ask that our guests please drop in the chat box, their name, their community, their role, the pronouns and race if they feel comfortable. And just please introduce yourself. We want to know who's with us today. And with that, I'll pass it to Donald to discuss guidelines for discussion.
So we'll go to the next slide. And again, today's training is on internalized racism. With all of our trainings, we ask people to abide by the courageous conversations about race. And these 4 guidelines are what we hope to do during the discussion today. There'll be some time for you to reflect and share, and we hope that you'll openly do that. But because the topic of race is one that we've avoided for most of the history of this country, and still avoid, expect to experience some discomfort as we talk about it today. So expect to experience it, and hopefully we can walk through it. We also ask that you stay engaged, and that's both physically, emotionally. We hope that you stay engaged in the conversation and that you're a part of it throughout, and you don't let the normal distractions that we go through on Zoom hold you hostage as we try to go through the slides today. We also are asking that you speak your truth. And when we talk about speaking your truth, it's you're not here representing anybody, not your profession, not your race, not your ethnic background. You're here as an individual. And when we're in discussion, we hope that you'll speak your truth, and we'll hear from you about your experiences, your thoughts, your feelings about the topics at hand. And finally, We've been doing a long series, and we've been doing this work for a couple of years. And what we have found and know to be true is that you have to expect and accept non-closure. The topic of race is a topic that's very thorny for a lot of people, and we will not get through 600 years of structural racism over the course of 2 hours. But I hope that you expect and accept that as we go through, and hopefully we can get a little bit further down the line. So these come from George Singleton. These courageous conversation guidelines were about education, but we love to use them as we talk about the concept of race in America. And so thank you, and I hope you will abide by all those as we move forward. And so back to you, Rashima. Actually, not back to you yet. I still have to talk about what we're doing today. So we're going to dive into 5 topics. We're going to talk about the different forms of racism. We're going to go a little deeply into internalized racism. We'll talk a little bit about racial trauma and how the day-to-day microaggressions and racial interactions and implicit and explicit bias, how they take a toll on the individual. And we'll dive into that a bit, touch on colorism a little bit. And the only reason we're not going deeper on colorism is we have a whole series on colorism we'll be doing later. So we'll touch on it, but we won't stay there for very long. And then we're going to talk about racial healing, the concept of working through all of what has happened as a result of dealing with, talking about being upfront about race. We'll talk about the healing process that comes from both internalized racism and internalized racial inferiority and support and superiority and inferiority that we'll be talking about a little bit. Sorry, got a little word soup there. We're going to talk about all that today. Please stay with us. We will love to have you involved. This is an interactive training, so we look forward to interacting with you. And with that, I'll pass it to Rashid.
Thanks, Donald. Next slide, please. So today, I know that Donald said earlier, we usually talk about 3 different levels of racism, and today we're introducing another one. And so I just want to walk you all through this. So typically we'll start at the top with systemic racism, which typically occurs across society. It's sometimes referred to as structural racism, which is institutions that make up the community, right? The normalization and legitimization of an array of dynamics, historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal that routinely advantage whites while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. We then have institutional, which occurs across institutions and organizations. It refers to the way in which institutional policies and practices create different outcomes for different racial groups, right? And the institutional policies that may never mention any racial groups, but their effect is to create advantages for whites and oppression and disadvantage for people of color and from groups classified as people of color. And then we have interpersonal, which occurs between individuals. And once we bring our private beliefs into our interaction with others, that is how racism is now interpersonal. The one that we will be focusing on today is the internalized racism, which is the result of people of color being a victim of racism and then unconsciously accepting racism as a reality and letting it become a part of who we are. It shapes our thoughts, beliefs, actions, behavior, and ultimately supports or colludes with racism. It lies within individuals unconsciously assimilating into their core being. Internalized racial oppression begins to manifest as internalized racial inferiority and internalized racial superiority. So now let's move to the next slide to take a deeper dive into internalized racism. So now we're going to take a deeper dive into the action and process of how internalized racism works and how it plays a role in the lives of people of colors and individuals who would identify as white as well. So first we have internalized racial oppression, which is a complex multi-generational socialization process that teaches people of color to believe, accept, and live or act out negative societal definitions of self. Then we have internalized racial superiority, which is a complex multi-generational socialization process that teaches white people to believe, accept, or live superior societal definitions of oneself. And then we have internalized racial inferiority, which is negative beliefs or feelings about oneself by Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And it stems beliefs about superiority or entitlement by white people. Now let's move into the next slide to break down the characteristics of white supremacy characteristics. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to talk through some of the characteristics of white supremacy culture that perpetuates the internalized racial superiority. In its context setting for going through these specific characteristics, it's important to realize that they are invisible, but yet very, very powerful and damaging to people of color. So they essentially damage people of color, but they can also damage everyone and are far-reaching. White supremacy culture is in the air we breathe. It gets in our clothes, it's in the water we drink. The longer you swim in a culture, the more invisible it becomes, right? White supremacy culture is the idea that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. White supremacy is the glue that binds together white-controlled institutions into systems and white-controlled systems into the global white supremacy system. And this system is perpetuated and reproduced by all the institutions of our society, which include the media, education system, science, religion, the government. There is no system that hasn't been touched by this, right? So now we're going to go through the list just quickly to touch on some of the characteristics. And we have perfectionism, urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, written words. And with written words, it's honoring only what is written down, even if what is written down is full of misinformation and lies, right? An erasure of all things to think about how oral histories and practices of Black, Brown, and Indigenous cultures have been erased over the time using these practices. And then we have paternalism, right? We have either or thinking, which reduces the complexity of life and the nuance of our relationships with each other and all living things into either or, yes or no, right or wrong, in ways that reinforce urgency. One right way that perfectionist thinking and abuse of power. And then we have power hoarding, which we see this all the time that takes place within our systems. And then we have fear of open conflict. So we try to, with this one, do call ins instead of call out to not just avoid conflict, but to really make sure that we're getting into the weeds of things and talking in a loving way and bringing everyone in and being inclusive in conversations and spaces. And then we have individualism. Our deeply embedded cultural story that we make it on our own without help while pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? And this feature of white supremacy culture is a toxic denial of our essential interdependence of each other and all living things, and the reality that we are all in literally this together. And then we have progress is bigger and more, objectivity and right to comfort. Now let's move to the next slide to discuss the resulting reactions to internalized racial superiority. So these are some of the resulting reactions that we have to internalize racial superiority. And then the first one we have is Indigenous invisibility. And this is where Native people, history, and culture is minimized, ignored, or erased from education, data, and media. We have anti-Blackness, right? So the Council for Democratizing Education defines anti-Blackness as being a two-part formation that both voids Blackness of value while systemically marginalizing Black people and their issues. The first form of anti-Blackness is overt racism. Beneath this anti-Black racism is the covert structural and systemic racism, which categorically predetermines the socioeconomic status of Blacks in this country. And they say that you can tell a person's socioeconomic status, or you can tell what a person's race is by their zip code. I find this very, very interesting. This structure is held in place by anti-Black policies, institutions, and ideologies. The second form of anti-Blackness is the unethical disregard for anti-Black institutions and policies. This regard is the product of class, race, and or gender privilege, while certain individuals experience due to anti-Black institutions and policies. This form of anti-Blackness is protected by the first form of overt racism. The next one we have is emphasis on white guilt. There's a helpful guilt and there's an unhelpful guilt, right? And the unhelpful guilt will keep us stuck. Next, we have fragility, anxiety, and silence that comes with the white guilt. It's the guilt or shame experienced by white people brought upon by the recognition of unearned and unfair racial privileges, the acknowledgement of personal racist attitudes or behavior, and or the sense of responsibility for others' racist attitudes or behavior. And now we can go into the white fragility, a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable for white people, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behavior such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors in turn function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. And then we have white anxiety, the anxiety or anger that white people experience due to fears that are losing status power, right? Which is a really big thing, as we talked about in our last slide, power hoarding, right? So it's subject to anti-white discrimination, and that the US is changing because of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, immigrants, and refugees. White anxiety defines whiteness itself as the victim under attack. And then we have white silence. When white people say or do nothing when witnessing racism, choosing white comfort and privilege over racial equity, which perpetuates racial violence. And examples of this include hearing racist remarks and saying nothing, seeing Black, Indigenous, and people of color being treated differently and saying nothing, making excuses for racist friends or family members and saying nothing. Next, we dive a little bit into what Donald talked about earlier, which was microaggressions, right? So these are the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership and the color of their skin. Next, we have individualism, right? The desire for individual recognition and credit, competition more highly valued than cooperation, which creates a lack of accountability and leads to isolation. Next slide, please. So here we're going to talk about internalized racial inferiority, which is a process that people of color go through, believing and accepting and internalizing inferior and subordinate images of themselves and their people, resulting in fear, anxiety, and uncertainty about challenging the institutions that have disempowered them. So when we look at Black, Indigenous, and people of color, which is an umbrella term, which we typically say BIPOC. It's meant to be more inclusive and highlight the specific experiences of Black and Indigenous folks. Relatively newer term in comparison to POC, which is people of color. It can be used to show solidarity. But some people don't like using the word Black, Indigenous, BIPOC, which means Black, Indigenous, people of color, because oftentimes white people use it as a way to avoid being specific about the groups that they're referring to, or that it lumps all people of color together as if everyone is the same and causes erasure. It can also exclude name and specific populations such as Pacific Islander, Asian, and Native Hawaiian. We bring this to your attention not to say that using BIPOC is good or bad, but rather to take a closer look at how BIPOC is being used and examine how terms can change over time. Next, we have stereotype threat. When people worry about that they might confirm a stereotype about a group that they're a part of. And this impacts performance, which can, in result, confirm the stereotype that they're wanting to disapprove to begin with. Some examples of that are lazy, angry, tardiness, and it's a way to continue to perpetuate the internalized racism. Next, we have colorism. Which is the discriminatory practice of favoring lighter skin over darker skin. And it happens both within the group and between the group, which is rooted in racism. Some examples of that is the one drop rule, where anyone with even one Black ancestor is considered Black. and skin lightening products, pills, creams, or soaps used to make your skin lighter to be able to fit in and be more favorable to white people. The impact is that poor outcomes for dark-skinned people, BIPOC, and separation within the Black community, light-skinned individuals feeling ostracized and guilted for white people's actions, and understanding that we're all a part of the same cloth. And a part of that is something that I've experienced myself, feeling exiled from the Black community, not knowing as a light-skinned Black female of, do I fit in with my Black community? And no. And also the fact that I didn't fit in the white community. And so colorism goes both ways. I feel like something that Donald had mentioned is that light-skinned people within the Black community face more discrimination from other Black people, but dark-skinned people face more discrimination from white people. And so that is the practice, the discriminatory practice of colorism. And then we have ethnocentrism, which is a belief that our own culture or ethnic group is superior to others. And this is really, really different from pride. And then we also have reverse ethnocentrism, which is the belief that another culture is superior to one's own, and there sparks a hatred of one's own culture. And then we have the model minority myth, which is the stereotype that Asians are intelligent, respectful, hardworking. However, this positive stereotype is really, really harmful, right? It flattens Asian Americans' identity, and it treats individuals and cultures as the same. It's really harmful to those who are furthest from the stereotype. It ignores disparities between and among various Asian groups and need to disaggregate the data. Example, poor outcomes for Southeast Asians over a different type of Asian depending on the geographical location. It erases racism against Asian Americans. The stereotype perpetuates the myth that Asians do not experience racism because Asians are successful and outperforming whites. And then we have pits Asian Americans against other Black, Indigenous, and people of color, which upholds white supremacy and reinforces anti-Blackness. Underlying message from the white people is, if Asians can make it, why can't you? And you equals non-Asian, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And there must be something wrong with your culture, your people, if you can't be as successful as Asians. And with that, I will now let Donald lead us into explaining how internalized racism develops racial trauma.
Thank you, Rashima. Next slide, please. So we are going to dive into racial trauma, just talk a little bit about racial trauma. And for those of you that work with people experiencing homelessness, we know that trauma is something that we encounter on a regular basis. And racial trauma is no different than the trauma that's received from things like sexual exploitation and childhood sexual challenges and childhood violence. All of those things produce trauma, and the effects of racial trauma are very similar. And we did just a little bit about how you get to this point where there is inferiority, and the racial trauma can be induced by anybody. One thing that we didn't talk about as much, Rashima touched on it a bit, is that there is a lot of racial trauma that's induced by people of the same racial and ethnic backgrounds who have different shades of color. People will use their socialization, and that socialization will be ingrained in their psyche, and that socialization process actually develops into what people start to develop forms of internalized racism. So how does that start? It starts at a very early age. We are socialized into our racial identity and our racial beliefs. The first stage of that comes at our very beginnings of life. We get through our family members, through our close associations, through some of our social networks, we start to be, our racial and ethnic identity starts to be developed. Uh, and then it continues to be developed by the media. The media will also drive some of our beliefs about racism. And finally, it's enforced in society. We see the positive benefits of being in one racial group versus being in another. And then we continue to learn through education, through learned education, about these different systems. And at that point, we're at a fork in the road and we can go in either direction. We can move towards an anti-racist world, a conscious world, or we can move back into internalized racism. This really started for me. I started working on internalized racism by doing focus groups. And what we encountered quite a bit, especially in the South, but all over the country, is that when we would go in and talk to groups about the impact of race in a community, there would be kind of a dismissal of racism. People would say things like, "That's just the way it is," and so the when it really kind of struck home to me is when I was in South Carolina during focus groups, and I did a focus groups with people in the homeless community, and they had not experienced racism, although we saw a stark disparity in outcomes. So when we looked at the data in that community, we saw that people in that community were being prioritized for permanent housing in a very disproportionate way. And so when we interviewed them and people did not see that, remember, we're in South Carolina. This is where Mother Emanuel happened. And so that was really kind of a defining moment for me to understand that people embrace the ideas and the methods of white supremacy to the point where they go into issues of self-hate. There's a hatred of their own people. So all of these characteristics happen as a result of that socialization. But kind of the one that really struck me was I interviewed the police officer who was the first on the scene, one of the first on the scene. I don't want to identify the person at Mother Emanuel. And I asked him about racism in the community. And remember, he encountered a person who had killed 9 people at a church service, and he didn't think there was racism in the community. So for me, that indicated that we really needed to talk about how people treat themselves and treat other races, because this isn't defined inside of any racial group. We know that internalized racism will cause people to have microaggressions and implicit and explicit bias towards people of different races as well. So you will see that people will start to embrace some of those dishonest and untrue stereotypes about other populations, and start to do that, start to treat them in the same way. So they're suspicious of people in stores, and we know all the behaviors. I won't go through all of those, but that becomes a practice within a race, in mixed race couples, but from one group to another. And sometimes it's around the thought of replacement, but it's also because people have internalized the idea that they're less, they're inferior, that they're less equal to other groups. And this is all rooted in structural racism, and started to justify the slave trade. But it actually started before that, when Christopher Columbus landed in the Bahamas. But it's, always has been characterized as he landed in the United States, but he actually landed in the Bahamas, and that's where we started. So we'll go to the next slide. So racial trauma will show up in different ways. So here are some of the symptoms, and they'll be very familiar to you, because you'll encounter people quite a bit in the system, in the shelter system, that have the symptoms of this kind of trauma. So shock, fear, shame, and anger, anxiety, depression, intrusive thoughts, hypertension, low self-esteem, sleep dysregulation, and severe symptoms of PTSD. And all of these will actually influence the behaviors of people that show up in your shelter system. So you will see people who show up who are angry, who are very fearful, distrusting, all of the very same symptoms that you have been probably trained about. But the issue is that these symptoms have not been connected to racism enough in our community. And it results in all kinds of things. We know that when we look at data across the country, what we found is that people being barred from a shelter or asked to leave a shelter are disproportionately people of color. And sometimes it's because they're displaying some of these symptoms. The other symptom that's not here that can be a severe result of this is violence. So when we see violence in communities, sometimes it's a result of multiple experiences of microaggressions and other kinds of racist practices. That trauma starts to have a lasting effect on people. And that lasting effect starts to manifest itself in these symptoms. And it has to be treated in the same way that we treat other forms of trauma. So we train often in our homeless service sector around trauma-informed care. And that same kind of trauma-informed care has to be a part of how we work with people of color, because it may not be as visible, but all of these symptoms and all of these behaviors people are carrying around as a result of racism. So if you see these and this person hasn't been had some kind of childhood experience that would be related to these symptoms, or they haven't been in the military, so their PTSD, you wouldn't understand where that comes from. Racism has the exact same effects over time on a person as all of those other situations that you encounter in the shelter system. So sometimes what I would really what I would really hope that people can do is take a little extra time with people when they are exhibiting shock, fear, shame, and anger, or any of these other symptoms, because we all, as people of color, encounter racism on a daily basis. They're like little pinpricks, and whatever degree that we have experienced it will manifest itself, and sometimes in very severe stages of this trauma. And so it's very important that we give people the opportunity to resolve those issues before we give up on them. So next slide, please. So we're gonna play a video, and this is a short video. It's about 4 minutes, and the video is gonna just lay out for better understanding of the issue of racial trauma and internalized racism. So if we could go to the video.
And Donald, you can just say something if you end up not hearing it.
Okay.
Racial trauma isn't just something that Black and Brown Americans experience regularly. It's something health experts say they're born into.
What makes it traumatic is how you experience it.
Similar to PTSD, racial trauma, or race-based traumatic stress, is the collective effect racism has on an individual's mental and physical health. It can be from major experiences like workplace discrimination or hate crimes, or it can be the result of an accumulation of many small indignities called microaggressions, or system or institutions that enforce structural oppression.
There was a national survey done by the American Psychological Association, and about 25% of all African Americans, 30% of all Native Americans report at least one of those experiences at least once a week.
The APA says not only do Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian American people significantly suffer from racial trauma, but that it can also compound with additional oppression based on gender or sexual orientation.
It depends on the intensity and the frequency of how often you experience racism or how severe the event is, but you might start with just race-based stress. So something will be racist and you'll be exposed to it and you'll feel stress, but racial trauma is really when it has those long-term effects. It really sticks with you.
Immediate symptoms can include increased heart rate or blood pressure, heightened cortisol levels, sweating, or tension in the body. Long-term chronic exhaustion and fatigue are among the most common symptoms.
Just sadness, underlying or overt anger, even thinking differently about yourself. So sometimes believing or starting to endorse those stereotypes that people might have about your racial group. If you're experiencing racial trauma, you might have some of that internalized racism.
Increased hypervigilance, the having the nightmares or flashbacks, avoidance of situations where they may, perceive it as threatening. All of those are consistent with what we find in race-related stress and PTSD. And so there's a lot of overlap.
Kind of, bouncing back and forth between that and numb, and never really feeling safe and socially connected and supported. And that also affects your brain and how your brain develops.
America's healthcare system impacts racial trauma too, making it more difficult not only to find help, but someone who understands a patient's experience. A 2015 study found that in the US, 86% of psychologists were white, 5% were Asian, 5% were Hispanic, 4% were Black. Meanwhile, some of the experts we spoke to are setting out to help. Dr. Candace Nicole Hargens released Black Lives Matter meditations for racial trauma victims and white allies.
Black Lives Matter.
Therapist Kelly Baker has helped organize Facebook Live videos with her local NAACP branch where anyone can connect to learn more about racial trauma. She's included sharing her own experiences.
I don't think you can say that there was ever a time for me when I did not that I was never exposed to racism. When I think about my family, my mom, my grandmother, and the things that my mother experienced that were clearly racist definitely affected how she parented her children.
What can be done to respond to racial trauma? Dr. Erlanger Turner tells Newsy adding an official diagnosis of racial trauma to the DSM-5, an encyclopedia of sorts for mental health professionals, is not the solution. He suggests racial trauma's existence is something everyone should be aware of, especially healthcare providers and policymakers.
If you are white, you do need to make sure that you try to understand that person's experience, that you provide some sense of solidarity, that you don't apologize. I think people oftentimes want to apologize in these situations, and that's really not helpful. We need solutions. And so I think that is one of those things that we have to do better and make sure that we take ownership.
Lindsay Thies, Newsy, Denver.
If you're a Kentucky...
Say again? Okay, so thank you guys so much for taking the opportunity to both hear as we try to journey through the idea of internalized racism, and also to talk about the converse of that and the internalized racial superiority. But we're going to stick into the internalized racism, and this is the inferiority. We can also talk about, because we know that between clients, that there are both kinds, that we do see both kinds of internalized racism from both the superiority and the inferiority standpoint in the shelter system. Interviewing clients, I've heard that quite a bit around the country. But we really want to get into this, and particularly because we know that there's a disproportionate amount of people of color in our shelter system. In some urban communities, in inner city communities, big cities, it's as much as 80%. In the District of Columbia, about 80% are people of color, 50% are Black males in general, who tend to have the highest incidences of microaggressions and other forms of racism perpetrated against them. But we want to go into breakout rooms, and we hope that these won't be facilitated, that you'll have the opportunity to talk about any of your anecdotal experiences, and use these two questions as a framework for discussion. And the first is, how do you think internalized racism may impact our clients? And secondly, how do you think internalized racism may impact how we work with our clients? So we want you to take some time. We're gonna stay in the small group breakouts for probably about 10 to 15 minutes. Hopefully that's enough time for everybody. Your groups are kind of small. And then we'll come back in and do a large group debrief so we can hear some of what the discussion, some of the discussion topics and where you went. But I encourage all of you during the small groups to come on to your camera so that you can see everybody, and please have a good discussion. So we're going to go to the groups. We'll cue you when it's time to come back. So please be as open and as conversational as possible so we can really learn from each other in the small groups. So again, the two questions are, how do you think internalized racism may impact our clients? And how do you think internalized racism impacts how we treat our clients? So we're going to go to breakout rooms now.
Okay, everybody, it's 11:42. So we're going to plan on seeing you right around 11:54. Thank you.
Kristen, I
think,
just let someone else in, so you might want to assign them.
Okay, thank you. I will do that.
Sorry to cut you off, Donald.
No, I was going to say the exact same thing that Aaron Hainsworth, I think.
All right, Janie, I have got you headed into a session. Are you here with us right now, Janie? Okay, I thought I saw her twice logged in. So I think she actually is in her session right now. So, well, you guys, we are running way ahead of schedule.
Are we? It looks like we're about 5 minutes ahead. Is it more than that?
We were going to have the small group breakout starting at 11:47. So yeah, we're a little bit ahead, but to me, that's way ahead because normally anything I'm in is way behind.
Exactly. And I thought I was going long, but I guess I wasn't.
Nope, you guys are right on track. So since we're ahead,
We have a new Tyson. I think Tyson just joined us.
I just assigned Tyson to a room while Kristen was talking. Sorry.
Oh, great.
And sometimes it may be people with a phone and a camera, a computer in different places.
So I'm going to have us skip the break because we're going to be under 2 hours. So we don't need to do the break. We can take that out. Yeah, that's just an HCD rule if something is 2 hours or over.
It's a good rule.
I'll just delete that sound real quick.
Okay, Donald, I was going to say for the racial healing, I don't know if do you want to do slide 23 and then I do slide 24?
Yeah, that's fine. It is probably better if you do 23 so that it breaks up my voice a little bit because I've been talking for a while. Is that okay? Or do you prefer to do 20?
Yeah. I really love coping mechanisms. You can jump in on slide 28 with the racial healing circles.
Yeah, I'm not going to do a lot on racial healing circles. I'm going to talk about it. How long so that's only a 10-minute segment anyway. But I didn't intentionally put in a list because I think the idea hopefully is that people start to create their own. I know there are some, like in San Diego has a bunch, and they're filtered throughout California in the community groups, and sometimes they're not called racial healing groups, but they give people a space for conversation.
Yeah,
but
I can talk. It's just usually through restorative justice practices. When I used to do that, we have a talking piece, and we have everybody sit in the circle. And depending on if we're coming to heal together or if we're coming to kind of bring healing to a situation that has occurred, we do it that way. So I love the circles.
And then if you listen to Dr. DeGrue or Dr. Dr. Singh, they really talk about like creating your own community that deals in anti-racist practices. And that one of the issues with kind of creating it outside of the workplace and like in your own community is we're so, the communities are so homogenous. People are so like, you don't get very much diversity in communities where people live yet. I think you said at the beginning, you can tell someone's race by their zip code, right? So if you do it in your community, the idea is that you're talking to the same people and you don't get to kind of move beyond your idea of diversity. So I know there's a suggestion. I know if you ever want to read a good like step-by-step on racial healing, Dr. Joyce Singh, it's not Dr. Joyce Singh, it's Dr. Annalise Singh. She has a book called The Racial Healing Handbook.
I'm writing that down.
Dr. DeGruy is pretty radical. So if you've seen some of her videos, like some people don't agree with them, because she has this one slide where like two parents are talking about their kids, and there's some merit in it. She says that the Black mother is downplaying the merits of her child. The white woman in this case is really kind of saying how great her child is. And Dr. DeGruy believes that's rooted in racism, that is rooted in slavery, actually, that you had to down talk your child so they wouldn't be sold. And she believes that that's fast forwarded to modern history.
Wow.
But some people like dispute that. I would probably say, I don't know about that one so much, but she has like volumes of stuff and she's been studying it for 30 years. So, who am I to tell her she's wrong?
It just said that you entered the waiting room.
I know. That is so strange. Would you like to be in here twice?
That's
Sorry,
really
I think I
cool.
hit it on accident. We'll see.
Oh, okay. Do I need to come back in?
Well, I'm gonna admit you and see what happens.
That'll be pretty weird.
You're joining.
I saw that I wasn't in a breakout room, so.
Oh, I've got you all as co-hosts. So if you want to pop into a breakout room, all you have to do is hit the breakout rooms tab at the bottom, and you can jump into any one or more than one that you'd like to.
We become parents in breakout rooms.
I was
Nobody
gonna
wants to
say,
talk.
I would just prefer, because they expect us to kind of lead the conversation, and I love when they come back and we have no idea what they talked about, and then it's like,
Yeah, it's always like a surprise what people have talked about in those groups, and people's experiences.
yeah.
I tried to, knowing some of the names of those who were in the session today, I tried to intentionally create breakout rooms with at least one person who likes to talk a lot or who likes to lead. So hopefully that'll help with the facilitation a little bit.
That's interesting that you've done enough of these that you actually know the talkers.
Oh yeah. There are some people that you can just kind of expect. So
The other book, Dr. Joyce DeGruy, her book is The Post-Slavery Syndrome.
Yes.
But she actually has paid classes. Almost took one.
You almost, what happened almost?
When would I do that? Between two businesses and a national organization, not much time left.
I'm going to broadcast the 2-minute warning to all of them.
So you guys think you think it's going okay? Is it?
Yeah.
Is it moving okay?
I'm
This is a difficult subject for people to grasp, though.
Oh, I am really into this. So
We haven't done it. We haven't done it. I felt pretty rusty because we haven't done it in about a year almost.
Well, you don't seem rusty.
Well, I'll tell you that experience with the I shouldn't have said that he was the actual officer investigating that case, but interviewing him and saying, you know, like it was maybe a year after that he had not seen racism. I don't know if he was like, and he was like very serious about it too.
Hmm. That's
Like
a
you've
very
seen
deep
it, and then,
denial.
well, in the same city, Walter, what was Walter's name? The guy that was, remember, there was a traffic stop, he ran and the officer shot him in the back and then tried to hide the gun, put a gun on him. Do you remember that one?
I remember it. I don't remember his last name.
Both of those happened in the same city. So, I mean, and then if you think about the history, this was where, you know, there was like a large influx after Reconstruction. A lot of politicians were elected in South Carolina, but they were run out of the state house
Hmm.
after Reconstruction failed.
Hmm.
So, I mean, probably the worst history of racism in the country. So,
It's pretty bad though overall when we've got a spectrum of what's the worst.
yes, yeah, it is. It's hard to say that when you know you think about like what happened in Tulsa and Louisiana and those places as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to give them the 30-second warning and they'll start coming back into the main room here.
You
I
guys are
think,
pretty fancy. You have 30-second warnings too. We get a
oh,
minute. That's all we get.
Zoom builds it in automatically. So,
Oh, okay. Okay.
all right. So I'm going to broadcast that to them.
We have the old version.
Okay.
Do you want to
Oh.
start off debriefing, Ashing?
Sure. And then if you want to put the slides back up so everyone can see the question again.
All right, hold on just a second. Close my window.
Okay, I think we've got everybody back in. So we're going to go ahead and have a large group discussion, and Rashima is going to kick it off for us.
Awesome, thank you. We are so excited and anxious really to hear what you all have been talking about in the breakout rooms. We really want to hear about how you all have broken down the discussion questions and some of the responses that came out of those. And the two questions again were, how do you think internalized racism may impact our clients? And how do you think internalized racism may impact how we work with our clients? So we would love for you all to come off of mute. You can stay off camera if you like, but to come off of mute and share some of your responses with us or drop some of your responses in the chat. But please, we would love to hear some of the responses.
Hi, my name is Jillian. I'm with the City of Fresno. And I apologize for joining this work group late. But so I was thinking about this question. And so to answer, the way I think about it is when we see somebody and services are being provided, and if they're of like a certain race, we may wonder, well, I don't understand how they can't get it. Or maybe they need a little bit more help with accessing and completing forms, and maybe internalized racism could be like, well, I don't understand why they can't do this on their own, or how come they never did something more for themselves. But it starts, back with education, right? The education system has failed some people, especially certain races. They failed in because they didn't teach them how to properly succeed in life. Like they talk about the prison industrial complex, policing schools, setting people up for failure. And I think sometimes with the services, because I manage the funding for our city, and I just work with multiple service providers, and seeing that even with our service providers, primarily their boards consist of white men, and how they've built their systems and what they perceive as beneficial, and the expectations that they have of their client, and maybe too high than from where the clients actually are. And it all starts from the beginning, right? Those are just my thoughts.
Right.
Yeah, no, Jillian, you touched on a lot of important things. You talked about the education system, and we talked earlier about institutional racism, of how no system is left untouched from this. You also talked about, which is really important, you said setting up for failure. And it's something that is really, really crucial. And so it goes into that point of when you internalize racism as a person of color, and I'm a person of color, so sometimes I go between there and we, because I am a person of color. And so for me, when thinking about the educational system and purposely the resources that we're not to receive so that we are left in the dark. And then when I started to speak a certain type of way, people would say, oh, you're so articulate, right? And it would be like, well, what does that mean? Because typically you wouldn't say that to a white person. You wouldn't say, oh, you speak so articulate, right? It would just be, oh, for a Black person, you speak so articulate. And us thinking that our language or our dialogue and what we use to speak to each other isn't good enough. So we try to, which happens is we try to change our language, right? We try to change the way we talk, the words that we use, instead of feeling comfortable with using our own language, that how we communicate with each other. And you touched on a lot of really great stuff. Donald, did you want to say something to Jillian's response?
No, I think that's incredibly important, because we do, our biases, we all have biases, and we all bring them into situations. And our internalized racist bias or racism bias will affect, how we perceive that client when they show up at the door. So if it's a young Black male, there's a perception sometimes that that person is going to be harder to deal with before we ever even talk to the person. Now, I'm speaking from my experience. I worked at every level of homeless service delivery, from outreach to case management, and have helped communities incorporate the system for prioritization. And it also affects the client in the way that sometimes they're not as trusting of the system. So prioritization is a really important part of that. Depending on who's across the table from them, because of their experiences with microaggressions and bias, and just their travels through life, they may not be as open to sharing as much information, because in their mind, sometimes the system has been failing them for so long that this person, if I share this information, it's going to harm me in some way. So those two things affect clients. And also, I think that as Jillian said, the reverse of that happens. So we have different expectations of people, which may be higher based on our own internalized racism. So, right. So when the ethnic exceptionalism that Rashima talked about, if we get an Asian client or a client that's white, sometimes we will have unrealistic expectations of people, because we know that failed systems are common in marginalized communities, but they exist in all communities. So we know that not every white person in America has had an easy ride. Although that easy ride hasn't been because of the color of their skin, a lot of people have suffered. And so we know that sometimes we place unrealistic expectations on people, not understanding that they could have come from a system that has been impacted and marginalized as well. So those are the things that I've encountered as I have worked in different homeless programs. You know, outreach is another one that internalized racism affects in many ways, because we may not want to go to that community that we feel is dangerous. And sometimes when you get to that community, you find out it's not very dangerous at all. It's just that our bias and our internalized racism has made us believe that we can't go into that community, and the reverse can happen as well. We can go in a community that we think is going to be safe because of the majority of the people in that community. It could be the most dangerous community we've ever been in. So those are a couple of things, but we want to hear from you guys.
Hi.
Veronica, I see you. You're about to talk.
Yeah, I'll speak up. There was two of us in our discussion, and I shared about a gentleman who I've worked with off and on for probably 10 or 15 years. He's Native American, and he was I can't say disenrolled because they're not a federally qualified tribe, but he was basically exiled from his tribe. He was rejected by them. He's got multiple severe mental illnesses, long history of substance use. And when I would speak with him, I could hear the internalized racism in the way he spoke about himself, the way he shared about, that he wasn't with the tribe anymore. It was almost like they were right and he deserved it. And he felt excluded because he has a very, very dark complexion. And so a lot of his peers would treat him poorly. In the encampments that we would see him in, he was often the one that was the most helpful, but would be abused often because he was kind and generous. And so I was just really struck by how he didn't think he deserved a good life and housing and to be well. He really believed, he had internalized, I'm not good and I'm not deserving. And we would try with our interactions just to show him that we care about him and that we think he has value. And that made a big difference, in a way. At least I hope so.
Absolutely. Thank you, Veronica. How about others? Do we have others that want to share?
I want to touch on something that Jillian said that really caught my attention. Jillian, you were talking about boards of directors for nonprofits, and my background is in nonprofit program administration. And years ago, I was working for a housing nonprofit as their director of programs. And I really think that you hit on something interesting. We had a board that wasn't entirely made up of white males, but it was definitely made up of people from, I would say, an upper socioeconomic background. Because I think they say there's three reasons that you put someone on a board: their connections, their money, or their knowledge. And we were just in a phase where I think it had to do more with their money, just given the economy at the time. But it really resonates to me, the fact that they really felt that they were doing a good job at trying to create programs that would allow the participants to embody, I think, what would be seen as a white model of success. And there were terms that were used, you know, that definitely fed into that model minority concept. And it was a very frustrating position to be in. We had a really diverse staff and an even more diverse group of clients and applicants that we worked with. And so it was, to me, one of, I think, one of the things that if I could go back and change something in my career, I wish that we could have brought a curriculum like this to them so that they could better understand and have some cultural humility and really understand that there are different definitions of success. And the most important thing when you're in a housing or social services environment is to meet someone where they're at and not assume that everyone is starting from the same point at the starting gate. So I just wanted to piggyback off of that with Jillian's comment because it just brought to mind some things from my own past professional experience.
And Kristen, this week I was at the National Alliance to End Homeless Conference, and I did a session with funders together. And if you really dig deep into philanthropy, although we're starting to see some change, I didn't think about that as a way internalized racism may impact our clients, but you hit on something really important, because if you look at like historical giving patterns, groups that are led by people of color actually got about 7% of the funding from foundations. And so one, you didn't have people, and I think this really kind of affects every group of people of color, but definitely like Native American groups where there's a lot of tradition and people are actually moved away from their traditions. Some of those groups that are led by people of color have a better understanding of those patterns. It also kind of affects us like when we create job programs. So, the workforce is another place where internalized racism plays a big role. And in programs, we often create job programs with positions that are probably very hard for people of color to get because of some of the other structural racism and structural issues like the criminal justice system and how that system is overrepresented by people of color who may commit the same infraction but be adjudicated differently. So there's all these other intersections that you brought up when you said that. So thank you for that comment. I think we are kind of at the end of this section. We can take a couple more if anybody else wants to share. We were a little ahead before. Well, awesome. Why don't we go on to the next slide if we've heard from everybody who wants to share. We want to get out of the problem and into the solution. So we're going to go into racial healing. Rashima, I think you were going to start us off, or did you want me to?
I am. Yep. So we're going to talk a little bit about racial healing from internalized racism. And that is, racial healing is a process that we undertake as individuals, community, and across society as a whole. In this healing, we want to recognize that our common humanity is here and acknowledge the truth of past wrongs and build the authentic relationships capable of communities and shifting our national discourse, right? And so the how we do this is we relearn the history of racism, really digging deep into finding out the truths. A lot of times for me growing up, even in the education system, all that we were taught was slavery, right? That's the only thing that we typically know about our history. And so we want to get back in there and learn the other facts and nature of our history, and then becoming your own historian. So like I said, self-teaching yourself, doing that deep digging to find all the things that we need to find to make it a true connection in all puzzle pieces and just not one piece of the puzzle. Becoming an anti-racist. And this is one of the sessions that we did 2 weeks ago, how to transform your organization from racist to anti-racist organization. And then grieve racism, right? So the stages of grief are denial, denying what's actually going on, and then it elevates into anger where everything is just frustrating and you're in a really angry state, and then it's bargaining, trying to accept what's going on but not really having the control over it to do that. And then we have depression, which I hear is one of the worst stages of grief, and then finally we come into acceptance of accepting what's really going on. And so taking those steps and using that to grieve racism itself. And then you apply those stages of grief to racism itself to really help you to move through it, right? It's something that we can't get around. And I always say the pain is in the way. The pain isn't in the way, it is the way. So we have to go through it to actually process this and to heal from it. It's no way to actually avoid it. And then you pursue healing from resources within your own community. And that may look different for a lot of different people, depending on which communities you're in and which resources are available. With that, can we move to the next slide? And so here is my favorite part. I love talking about coping mechanisms, and especially coping mechanisms for healing racial trauma. And so the first thing we want to do is protect, right? We want to try in our best way to avoid triggers and set boundaries. It's really hard for people to set boundaries because setting boundaries to some people means being mean or being off-put or disengaged, when really you're protecting yourself, which is really important to make sure that you're protecting your mental health, and then also, if needed, your physical self. And this means sometimes avoiding relationships with people who dismiss the seriousness of racial trauma, somebody who is denying what is taking place because either they aren't a person of color and they don't know how to relate to that, or they are a person of color and they haven't done the different stages that you have to get there to be able to heal from that. And then we go into process, right? So we want to talk to like-minded friends or family members, and then knowing when to seek support. Sometimes you need to be alone to process, right? And then other times you need to be around a circle that's really supportive and can be there for you. And sometimes support means talking it out. Sometimes support is, we're not going to talk, I just need you to be in the room. Sometimes support could be just a hug of acknowledging how you feel in that moment. So knowing when to seek that support. Also, a part of processing is recognizing symptoms. So the symptoms that Donald talked about earlier, when you're going through that, the anger, the grief, if it escalates and it actually gets to PTSD, understanding that you are experiencing those symptoms and the why to your experience of those symptoms. So that's a part of the process to really recognize that. And then the other part of the process is to not act on impulses. So one of my favorite activities I love to do when coping is to practice a delayed circuit. So it's really a 60-minute response. So it goes, you be active for about 10 minutes, right? You go on a walk, you exercise, you clean up, something to just move, and then you be engaged for 20 minutes. So you either draw or you journal, you do poetry, you sing a song, you do something that's gonna really keep you engaged in that moment. And then my favorite part is be soothed for 30 minutes. So the majority, that 50% of that 60-minute, you take a bath, you listen to music, you read, you light candles, whatever it is that soothes you, you be in that moment. And so we call that a practice delayed circuit, so that you're not acting on immediate impulses and you're not reacting right in that moment, but you're taking that time, as we call it, to process. So make sure after you be active and after you be engaged to really do something that's soothing to you. And then, of course, we have self-care methods. We love self-care. I always tell people to practice self-care. And this is something that I even have to implement within my own life. And so we want to develop and prioritize self-care methods. And that could be different for everybody is different. And so that could be exercising, meditation, deep breathing, that could be therapy, that could be reading, that could be music. That could be going for just a nice, calm walk. That could be looking at the sky, bird watching, whatever is self-caring to you. Take that time and put that aside and do that for you as you're going through this. And this is how one of the best methods of coping with the racial trauma is really taking that time to feed you and feed your energy, feed your soul, feed your mental. And then also something that we found really helpful is to go on a limiting media diet. So stay away from social media, right? Sometimes even stay away from the news. The news, I personally do not watch the news unless I am told there's something going on, please go watch it, because the news is very triggering. Every time you turn on the news, it's a black male was shot 60 times by the cop or something. It's very traumatic, honestly. And so for people of color, people like myself, when things get too dark, too deep, and I need to put that time away, I have to put a pause on the media. I have to put a pause on it and be in my own world, and I have to reset and really practice self-care. Another part of coping is to protest, right? What can we do about it? What's going to help us to feel better and being active about the issue, right? So what we can do is peacefully protest. We can organize a group of like-minded people. We can sign petitions. We can advocate for certain legislations to be in place to kind of stop and cease or at least reduce some of the things that are perpetuating the racial trauma. We really want to make sure that we're doing it in a peaceful way, because we're not trying to activate more violence in whatever form, shape that can be. And then also something that we talked about earlier were calm call-ins versus call-outs. And so this is something I've been practicing not only in my professional life, but personal as well, is calmly, peacefully calling someone in. And what that means is when something, when you feel personally attacked, you feel like something wasn't right, or just something, you have an off feeling and you're like, that's wrong. Instead of taking on a negative attitude about it and immediately attacking that person, what we want to do is we want to stop. We want to calmly tap them, or we're in Zooms now, right? So we use the raise hand function, or we can do a direct message within the chat, and we can say, hey, I noticed that you said this. Coming from my perspective, you can calmly explain to them, right? It's always good to know the why. So we want to calmly explain to them, that's not directly correct, or that doesn't, sit well with me. You can calmly discuss that with them. And for instance, something that happens a lot within the racial equity spaces is we talk about person first centered language, right? When we talk about people experiencing homelessness, a lot of people say, because we're so used to it, homeless people. And the first thing that comes to mind, we're in these spaces where we want to really, really help people experiencing homelessness. But in all honesty, if you're on the street or if you're walking and somebody says homeless person, you immediately have a negative image in your head. You immediately think this person's going to stink, this person has no clothes, this person is driving with the cart. There's a negative image associated with that. And so we want to disrupt that image, which is why we want to make sure that we're putting the person first before their situation, that the person is not their situation. So if I'm in a meeting, if somebody says that, I'll either type it in the chat a nice calm way, or I'll come off of mute and I'll say, here in this space, we use person first language. I'll do a calm call in, but then I'll also explain the why. I don't point it out and say, you did this wrong, you shouldn't have said this or that, but I calmly, the way I'm processing is I'm calmly saying we as a collective, and making sure that we are moving forward together. And so those are the coping mechanisms that we have for coping with racial trauma. And with that, I will turn it to Donald for our next slide to discuss racial healing circles.
So a couple more things before we go to racial healing circles. Just a couple of examples of calling in and calling out that Rashima just discussed. So when you call somebody in, you're asking them in a very, very gentle way to really explain what they're talking about. So if someone makes a expression that you believe to be one that is racist or a microaggression, you ask them, so tell me a little bit more about that. Or you say something to the effect of, have you ever considered this? Another way of calling people out is saying, we don't agree on that, so let's change the topic. And the important thing to remember is that this is not one race to another, it's within our races as well, because oftentimes some of the most hurtful language that you hear are inside of your own race. You'll be around people and they'll make statements that you just don't disagree with. So in an anti-racist world, if you want to be an anti-racist, you have to actively be involved in addressing and interrupting racism. So calling in and calling out is a good tactic that we'll talk about a little bit more. And so we try to give you as much as we can on a topic, but it always bleeds into other things. So there are some other things that you can also do when it comes to coping with racial trauma. We touched on a little bit earlier, being more race conscious, and that's really understanding the underlying effects of racism and really diving deep into being able to interrupt it in your own way, wherever you feel comfortable, is another mechanism. But if you really want to get to the point where you have transformed and you're part of this community of love that is around addressing racism, one of the things you do is you become part of a community. And on our next slide, there's a picture here of one of the forms of communities that are happening all over the country, and these are racial healing circles. And if you notice in that circle, there are people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And what they're doing is exactly what we're doing now. They're getting together as a community and they're going through the process of healing by talking about these issues in a forum that's upfront, that's open, that allows for very serious conversation. I do believe that you can't do this as a one-off. It has to be an ongoing process. You have to be every day doing all the things we talked about earlier, becoming your own historian, learning history. For me, that was incredibly helpful. I had always been stuck in this idea, and this was my internalized racism, because I hadn't studied enough. I often wondered why there wasn't a resistance from people of color around slavery. What I learned when I studied a little more is that resistance happened all the time in the African American community, in the Asian community, in the Latinx Hispanic community. There were all kinds of examples of people fighting back, but I didn't get to that until I learned a little bit more about the history. So those are the kind of things that you start to unpack when you relearn your history. But again, the racial healing circles, I know there's a number in San Diego, and we will try to get you more information about that. There is a whole process that you have to go through to kind of re-socialize yourself about racism. So the first part of that is identifying your racial identity, understanding who you are. And there's a couple of really good publications that can help you with that. One is called the Racial Healing Handbook. It's by Dr. Anjali Singh, and I put that in the chat. That document actually has actual workshop exercises that you can do to step by step go through the point of being able to understand your racial identity, grieve the racial internalized racism process. There's also publications that help you identify what it means to be to have been affected by internalized racism. There is a and we sometimes use this, and Rashima, we can send that the list of places where you can identify yourself as being someone who is actually a product or is actually experiencing internalized racism. You kind of discount your own race. You kind of if you're a store owner, for instance, you're following people of color around because you have bought into the stereotype that they may take something. If you bought into it when you drive down the street and you're in a neighborhood, you'll put locks on your door. So these are some of the practices that help us to understand that we've internalized racism. But again, these racial healing circles are outside groups. But I would also encourage people on this call to consider doing something inside as well. A lot of the groups we work with create different racial and ethnic work groups that include everybody, that have the same concepts as a racial healing circle, but it's within the workforce. We've seen that happen a lot. So I would encourage you to look into racial healing circles, but also community-based organizations that are practicing anti-racist practices. There's a lot out there. And this becomes a new way of life for people once they get involved. But all those other steps are just as important. You have to grieve racism, you have to relearn, re-educate yourself about it, and you have to really think about what your racial identity is. So we'll go to the next slide. So to help our clients heal, we have to remember again that structural racism is traumatic in the same vein as other forms of trauma. We also have to understand that trauma must be acknowledged and addressed, or it starts to grow within people. Some of the techniques that we can use, trauma-informed care, also motivational interviewing, because a really good way to really understand where our clients are coming from, what's affecting their attitudes and behaviors and actions. Motivational interviewing really allows us the opportunity to do that. And again, racial oppression should be treated as any other form of trauma, and trauma-informed care is an effective approach. And I hope we're practicing that anyway, but we can actually use that as practice when we're talking about helping our clients heal from racism. And it may be simple things like acknowledging ethnic celebrations within our shelter system, or making sure that in our hiring processes, that we're making sure that there are people that people in our shelter can identify with. A lot of those things can mitigate some of the trauma that our clients are going through, but it's really important that we do and it isn't about a DSM designation. It's really about just understanding how much of an impact this thing we call racism and structural racism has on people, and how many different facets of their life are connected to it. So we just encourage you to really, in every one of your programs, practice trauma-informed care, motivational interviewing, and making sure that you identify and recognize trauma and mitigate it to the extent that you can. Next slide. So we want to do another discussion. I know that was a little brief, a little briefer than the first discussion, but we want to know what you can do to promote racial healing for yourselves and for your clients. And we're not going to break out into small groups here, because we want to make sure everybody gets a chance, if they can, to be a part of this discussion. So if you could, again, want to see who we're talking to. So if everybody could please come on to their cameras, and we can start this discussion. What can you do to promote racial healing for yourselves or for your clients based on what you've heard? Or share with us something that we may be able to share with other people about how you can promote racial healing.
And Donald, I wanted to just say that Veronica had put something into the chat during the presentation, and she says, during the breakout session, we spoke about setting boundaries to protect ourselves. I'm reflecting on how I would set boundaries that work for me, and often do not consider what the other person needs. I'm working on making boundary setting a collaborative process to understand what we both need, not just what I need.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Did you want to touch on that anymore, or since I think it's been a while since you got to say that, did you want to share?
I don't know. It really captures everything I was thinking about. In the group, we were some of the feedback was that, boundaries are important and we have them for a reason. But just as I'm reflecting here, I'm thinking about, not just setting the boundary, but how I set them, how I'm speaking to the other person. And I know that a lot of times it was in an emotionally heated moment. Maybe the person was maybe verbally expressive, very loud, and those kind of things make me nervous. And so I need to be aware of my own emotions and how I'm allowing them to impact me when I'm interacting with others, especially those who are BIPOC, because I'm in a position of authority. And I set an example for a lot of people in this community, and what I do matters. And if I'm not being a collaborative, that's not going to be a cultural change in our system, and we really need that. And it's hard to know in the moment, what we're doing. And so that's why I think sessions like this are really important, because it gives me an opportunity to really reflect on what, my past behavior, my past actions, and how I can really, make improvements. It's hard to do in the moment.
Absolutely.
For
But
that.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Rashid.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say thank you for that. And I think something you said that was super important is the hardest thing to do is set boundaries in this culture, and not just my culture of being a person of color, but just in general. From birth, we are taught to not have boundaries. Typically, we're taught that we need to smile all the time, like don't not smile, don't show your emotions, right? That's a emotional boundary where it's like, if I feel what I feel, I need to express that. If somebody wants to hug you, it's like, if you want to say no because you feel uncomfortable, like that's a boundary I have. Right? These are simple things that when you meet people, they're natural. You just walk up to somebody and you hug them when you see them. A person may feel uncomfortable due to past trauma or due to past sexual abuse, that they may not want people to hug them, but they're told that that is how you're supposed to act in public. That's appropriate. You cannot set that boundary for yourself. So in our culture, we're taught to naturally not set the boundaries we need for ourselves. And so when it's time for us to create boundaries, there is that that difficulty of, how do I do this? How do I tell somebody, I don't want to hug you, it's not personal, but I'm setting that boundary for myself because when a person touches me, I feel triggered, right? And so thinking about going deeper and thinking about the racial trauma of how do you set boundaries around that and do it in a way where it's, I want to be respectful to the both of us, but I have to care for myself first and set that boundary. And so I'm so happy that you spoke up on that, because that's something that we don't talk about often when setting boundaries. We tell people, hey, set boundaries and do what you got to do, and not understanding that it's so difficult because our culture tells us to really not set boundaries, that we need to be a certain way. So thank you for uplifting that. Donald?
Well, I was just going to say, I think also, those boundaries are often on a personal level as well. So we, again, some of the loudest voices when it comes to racist behavior, whether it's internal or external, microaggressions or implicit or explicit bias, whatever it is, happens within our family unit or those closest to us. And so sometimes, if this is the way of life that we want to continue, it's important to set boundaries there as well. You have to let people know, where you are at on that spectrum of racial healing and anti-racist behavior, because, whether it's about another BIPOC group, or whether it's about white people, or whether it's about your own race, often you have to set those boundaries with people. So that's another place with boundaries. The other part where that comes into play is there are cultures where hugging is really a taboo activity, but it's really important that you make sure that you understand people's culture when you encounter them, and if you care enough, you'll do that. So there's different religions, different ethnic backgrounds where hugging is not permitted. So understanding, the cultural competency aspects are really important when it comes to boundaries as well. Paula, did you want to say something? I'm sorry, that's Pamela.
Hi, really, I just popped onto my camera because I thought that it was nice that you wanted to see us all and our smiling faces. But I can speak a little bit about what I think I can do to promote racial healing. I'm glad to have been involved in these conversations, as I'm better understanding now the situation that has befallen our society, because I didn't really understand what all the hubbub was about, you know, until now. And I'm glad I'm hearing that this racial inequity has been systematic for a long time. I was shocked when I learned what I learned in school was lies. I was hurt, you know, and now I'm starting to understand that I can't be oblivious to all of that. I have to embrace it, understand it better, be curious about causes and effects, and rally against continued systemic racism. And in so doing, forgive myself as a white cis woman for the transgressions that have happened in the past by people that I'm related to, and for just not having taken the time or thought necessarily to understand. I got a lot of training on cultural competency and fairness and equality, but I never got training on equity. And so my approach to clients was always sort of just always the same, wanting to bring myself as a public servant to my job and to help people in the most efficient way possible, regardless of who they were. And so now I realize that I was perpetuating systemic racism by not taking the time to understand that all of my clients had all kinds of different needs and came from all different places and spaces. And so I want to lean in more now and try to understand people and bring some humbleness to my public servant role, as opposed to my efficient and gregarious nature, which doesn't always, I imagine, suit people who are having racial trauma related to racial issues. And so that's what I think I will do to promote racial healing, just be present in this journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Pamela.
and thank you. Yeah,
And
you touched on some really important tidbits about forgiveness and the difference between equality and equity. And I think that's something that, as you said, forgiving yourself is also helping to promote racial healing, because when we internalize racism and we accept that inside unconsciously, or whether it's consciously, once we become aware, there's a forgiveness that has to happen in us as well, right? When we talk about the stages of grief to racism, and so helping clients, you know, that's a part of it. The forgiveness part of forgiving myself for believing what I believed and internalizing that and making that normal, and talking about, you know, revert ethnocentrism of really thinking that another culture was superior to my own. And so I think that was something super important. So I just wanted to thank you for uplifting that.
Thank you. Do we have others that want to share how what they can do to promote racial healing for themselves or clients? Carrie, did you want to say something, or you just came off camera because we asked nicely?
I actually had a comment, if you don't mind, that I can jump in on. Part of my job, not just here with ICF and HCD, but in my last job with the CSC, was doing monitoring. And so I've looked at a lot of program policies and procedures and client files, way more than I'd ever hoped to do anymore, but I'm still doing it. But one thing that I noticed recently that I think it ties into what we can do to not just necessarily promote racial healing for our clients, but to not contribute more towards any internalized racism that they are experiencing in the way that we provide services. And so, for example, there was one client that was staying at a shelter that was given multiple notices about different behavioral things. And it wasn't necessarily like shouting or violence or things like that, but it was like one of the letters was, other people have complained about your body odor and you have to shower every day. Or another thing about, there's no phones allowed after lights off and you were caught in your bed on your phone. And I just think of these are little things that, I mean, to be honest, I work remotely. I do not shower every day. And every night at bed, before bedtime, my lights are out and I'm on my phone. So it's like, you are bringing shame and a lack of dignity and a lack of respect, I think, to people when they are living in that congregate setting. There's room for you to, see yourself differently or either better than, or that better than they do, and taking away kind of their sense of autonomy. And I just think about how all of those little actions that could, that are being given to that client and how that in turn, impacts his sense of internalized racism and like what types of, messages he's being told about, the way that his appearance is or things like that. And even what the staff is then projecting onto them, that like our clients are, smelly and that they don't listen to rules and, things like that. So I think that there's just a lot of things that programs and staff could do differently to just really elevate the dignity of their clients, that I would think in turn would help promote that racial healing for their clients.
Erin, thank you so much for saying that. It reminds me, I've been doing a series of focus groups with people experiencing homelessness about the shelter system. So it's reimagining shelters. And so one of the things that they say, as we do our thematic analysis, one of the top line issues is people want to be treated like adults. And so we do kind of relegate them to kind of a parent type relationship. And it is very debilitating to people. And as you said, it's things that we take for granted, we do all the time, but for them it's a cardinal sin. And on top of it, we have to think about, what is the other side of that, right? So should somebody be forced to live outside in the elements because they don't wash up as much as we think they should? Or in your other example, they had their phone on late at night. And there are cultures, again, this is another cultural issue, that don't use deodorant. And so, we have to take the time to think about the consequences of kind of what we're putting on people's the kind of values that we're putting on people that may not be a part of their value system, but we've perpetuated this system that is the norm, and so it does have a negative impact. So thank you for recognizing that. The other thing they said is they wanted to be treated like human beings, and then the other part of it was safety. And do we think about that enough? When we put people in a congregate shelter system. So thank you for bringing that up. And the monitoring thing we talked about also, just in terms of funding, sometimes, what we think is kind of the norm. And I know you have to go by guidelines when you're monitoring, but sometimes, that's why it's so important to infuse the voices of lived experience in this work, because they will let one, these rules don't make sense to me, because of my cultural background, because, I want to be an adult. So that's why it's so important that we infuse people and we make it diverse, so that we get those opinions, and we don't go into blind spots. Because if you don't make the group that you're talking to wide enough and diverse enough, you'll run into a lot of blind spots. So that's the other thing that comes up to me, is really making sure that there's inclusion of people. And that is a real way that we didn't talk about, that you can address and promote racial healing, listening to our clients and making sure we're listening to a diverse group of clients. Thank you for bringing that up. Rashima, did you want to add to that, or do we have other people that would like to talk? So I'd love to hear from anyone who may be from a marginalized population, at least in terms of race or ethnicity. How does this resonate with you, internalized racism? What are your takeaways? Is there anybody who wants to be a part of a courageous conversation? And Pamela, if you were about to say something, you still can.
I think I am part of a marginalized population in that I'm Jewish, but
Okay,
I'm not
absolutely.
sure, and I
No,
don't want to be presumptive.
no, if you look at history, one of the other most marginalized groups has been the Jewish faith, especially in America. And, you know, we see a rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes right now. So you absolutely have a right to share your thoughts.
I would like to see this movement morph into a discussion about religion, in as much as I know that racial equity is important, so is religious equity. And I just wanted to, you know, put that on the radar whenever I'm asked in one of the polls afterwards, you know, what else would you like to discuss, or where can we go from here? I think religious equity would be a great topic to explore. It'd be
Well,
hard, just like
and,
racial equity is hard.
and Pamela, the two are inextricably linked. Really, you know, religion was a large part of justifying slavery. And religion has been a way to ostracize people, a way to marginalize people, and also a way to victimize people. So we don't have a training on religion yet, but maybe it's something we should look at, because again, if you look back into the history of slavery, some of that slavery started with people from the Islamic faith. And so some of the original slaves were Middle Eastern slaves as well. And then that was used to justify slavery in other religious communities. And part of the difference in being superior versus inferior had to do with which religion you were a part of. And then you have the idea of forced religion. So our Native American children were forced into particular religions. Our Latinx community was forced into religious beliefs and made to assimilate. And that still happens today. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of people that are pushed into assimilation in order to reap the benefits of the dominant society. So religion is a huge part of that. We should probably think about, you know, how we address that, because it's always a touchy subject as well. And, you know, people, you know, most of our wars have been fought because of religion. So but we may need to think about how to infuse that into the racial equity work.
I really
But thank you for
appreciate,
raising that.
yeah, I appreciate all your comments on religion, Mr. Whitehead. That was, yeah, so true. And just the Pope was in Canada, I think, just this week, apologizing to the Native Americans for all the unmarked graves that they found, that all the Native American children in. So it's a hot topic.
Yeah, and you know, the other issue is that it's been a pretty loud discussion in Canada, but it hasn't been discussed because the same thing happened in the United States as well. But we haven't had as much of a reckoning with it as they have in Canada. So yes, Kristen, I guess we need to think about how we shape a workshop around religion, because that is the source of discontent in much of America. So maybe that is another topic we can think about developing something around.
Absolutely.
Thank
I
you.
think we're winding down, but did we have any brave volunteers that want to share? Thank you all who have shared. All right, Amy.
Okay, so just thinking about promoting racial healing for ourselves. Just thinking about what I tend to do is so I work in tribal affairs at HCD, and I told the group, one of my groups, where it can be the work we do can be difficult because of all the sort of teaching, right, of Native Americans, of California Indian tribes, of their history, of the reasons why they are where they are today. They're the first homeless, group in this country. But sort of that erasure that has happened, that happens today, and the feeling of invisibleness is how do I kind of get, living with all the time in schools and in neighborhoods where you living through the microaggressions, but internalizing this racism, right? And then just kind of going, okay, how do I? And then it was only until I got to college that I wanted to find out more. Like, how did this happen? How did we get to where we're at? Because it wasn't taught in school. But for me, when I'm struggling, when I have days that I struggle, I always I look to family, I look to my community, and it's there where I feel embraced. And I look, that's where I look to for my healing. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out what sort of ways. Of course, I try to spend time with myself, but I need to feel love outside of myself too. I need to go and grab that and get that hug, and that feeling of understanding, but yeah, so, there's a lot of questions I do have, and I'm really grateful for you guys for having these sessions. I missed a couple, but if this does come again, I would like to take it again. But yeah, well, I want to ask this question: just calling out versus calling in. How about when you? How do you do that? I feel afraid at times. I've been in different areas where I've worked to call out my supervisors when they're, you feel like retaliation, possible this or that, and I'm sure it's everywhere, right? So this is just not just like the workplace; it's just everywhere you go. So authority. How do you? What is the calling out versus the calling in? Because I feel like I was hearing a few years ago, like, call it out. When you hear it, call it out. Now I'm hearing call in. So can you speak to that a little bit more?
Sure. Rashima, you want to touch on that because you started the conversation?
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to thank you for sharing. I resonate so much with what you said, and it touched me, and so I'm right there with you, and I'm happy that you have a support group. And this is a touchy topic of calling in. And we talked earlier about white supremacy characteristics, right? In the sense of power hoarding, and how that authority plays a big role in that. And so when we say call in, I think Donald said it perfectly. It's a gentle way of us calling it in to not avoid conflict, right? It's not that we want conflict, but to kind of alter the situation where we don't have to go into conflict, because conflict is such a negative word. We want to have an open discussion. We want to have an open space, a comfortable space where there's respect there, and it's a gentle way of calling somebody in. And I think Donald used different methods that I did pertaining to asking questions, the way that you just asked us, right? So if something happens, I do this exercise called the 5 whys, where I ask why, right? And a person will give you an answer. And then I ask why again, and the person will give you another answer. And so I keep digging and I ask the same thing because I want to figure out the root of it. And so if it is racism at play, let's uncover it, right? And I'm doing it in a gentle way instead of just saying overtly out. Calling out is, that's racist, why would you say that? And then that changes the climate in the room. And then there is a form of okay, I think I'm gonna face retaliation because of the way I say it. And so calling in is not just about that respect layer or doing it in a gentle way where it's making sure that we don't run into the conflict, but also a protection layer, right, of how we say it. And also I operate from a place of impact over intent, because even if I thought I was calling it in, right, because I was so angry in that moment, because it could have affected me personally as a Black woman, I could have impacted the way I said it, could have had a different impact over the intent that I meant. And so with calling in is just a gentle way of doing that, and also altering the word. And so we also talk about how language and dialogue are two different things, right? And language is the words that we say, dialogue is how we say it. And so I think that's also a part of the difference from the calling in factor versus the calling out. Yeah, Donald,
So,
did you want to touch a little bit more?
well, I would just say in some situations, it's a calling up. So we talked about calling in and calling out. Sometimes if it's your supervisor, calling them in may, start a retaliatory practice. So in that case, I think if there's a human resources department, that's where you have to go to if that kind of behavior continues. I think questioning that person and just asking them to explain exactly what they meant, but documenting that and sharing that with your human resources department is really important. Now, when you're talking about somebody out in the community, everybody has a supervisor. So if it's a law enforcement, there's a complaint process that you can go to. If you go into a place of business that is a retail outlet, they have a supervisor there. So I call out people all the time. So I used to live in Florida, and I start documenting that every time I went to a restaurant in Florida, they gave me the table next to the bathroom. And, I thought it was coincidence at first, and then it just kept happening. So I had to call out. I had to start talking to, that's not where I'm going to sit. And it's not okay to keep sitting me there. So that's one example I've had in my life. The other thing I want to say, because we're in the last couple of minutes, is this: it is important for all of us to understand that we are the first contact for our children when it comes to creating a racial identity. So we are compelled, if we truly believe in these principles that we've been talking about, to be that first positive socialization in their lives. So to help them get a true understanding of history, and also to help them get a true understanding of how they can identify and exist in a world that's free of racism. We are the first teachers, and we should all do that, because all of this starts with how we get socialized in the beginning. So we're going to stop there because I know Christian has announcements, and thank you all for your participation.
Oh, well, thank you to Donald and Rashima for another great session. Really appreciate it. And really appreciate all of you who attended this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information on the next Racial Equity Series sessions, and a 3-question survey will pop up as the session ends. Please provide your feedback so we can ensure these training sessions are as useful as possible. Thanks to everybody, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.